Okay, hi, good evening. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Okay, the Torah reading this week is VaEtchanan. It's the second portion of the fifth book of the Torah, and it contains in it the Ten Commandments for the second time in the Torah. We have the Ten Commandments in Exodus, chronologically when it's given, and we have it also this week here, beginning on page 968, 969. It's chapter 5, and it starts with sentence number 6. This is going to be a hopefully a discussion class. Let's see what happens here. Okay. So, again, I hope everybody can hear me. It's a little noisy in the room I'm in. Can everybody hear me okay out there? Okay. So let's take a look at the Ten Commandments. And the title of this class is The Ten Commandments, What is Missing? Okay, what is missing? So the Ten Commandments are lined up in front of you on the shared screen. Number 1, I am Hashem your God. I'm not going to read them all to us. So, and by tradition, on the sheet on the left-hand side, the first 5 are mitzvot, which are considered to be between man and God. And the right-hand side, 6 through 10, are considered those commandments that are between man and man, which is a nice, neat package, except for number 5, and we've talked about that in the past in terms of why honor your father and mother is in the left-hand column and not in the right-hand column. Let's look with this sheet, and then we're going to have a general discussion which is meant to shed light on the source below. We have a tradition. The Ten Commandments comprise 10 different categories under which the other 603 mitzvot fall. And this is where the idea that when the revelation at Sinai, which involved God speaking the first 2 of the Ten Commandments, as is mentioned explicitly in this week's Torah reading, and then Moshe repeating after God the other 8 mitzvot of the Torah, this was the revelation at Sinai. So it was really not the revelation of the entire Torah, word for word. They didn't start at Bereshit and go through the end, especially since many events hadn't happened yet, but rather it was the pronouncement of these 10 statements. And by tradition, we call this Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, because these 10 commandments, as it says in the source from Rav Sadia Gaon, they comprise 10 general categories, and the remaining 603 mitzvot all fall under these categories. And if you look at his book, Sefer HaMitzvot, by Rav Sadia Gaon, he actually puts them into columns and covers all 613 mitzvot. Here's what I want to look at together. We know there's a mitzvah in the Torah, there's a statement in the Torah, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. It's in Leviticus 19:18. And very famously, Rabbi Akiva teaches in the Sifra, this is the fundamental principle of the Torah. Zeh klal gadol b'Torah. So the question I want us to think about is, if the 10 Commandments contain all 613 mitzvot, and if according to Rabbi Akiva, you shall love your neighbor as yourself is the most fundamental principle of the Torah, why is it missing from the 10 Commandments? Or alternatively, where do we see it in the 10 Commandments? And the reason I want to discuss this tonight is because I think it could give us perhaps a better understanding of what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, so that's the challenge we have for today.
Did Rabbi Akiva ever make the claim that this one fundamental principle, love your neighbor as yourself, somehow encompassed all 613 commands?
No, I don't, although you should know something. I don't know if everybody can hear. so well, but Frank is asking the question, did Rabbi Akiva claim that love your neighbor as yourself encompasses all 613 mitzvot? No, he doesn't. But certainly if he considers it the principle, the fundamental principle of the Torah, how could we feel that the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments given at Sinai, cover the entire Torah unless we can see within the 10 Commandments the principle of love your neighbor as yourself? So it's a little bit of an inverted question. You know what I'm saying? But I think the question is valid, because certainly Rabbi Akiva is not disputing the notion that God, in gathering the Jewish people at the foot of Mount Sinai and pronouncing the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments as we have them written in this week's Torah reading and as they're listed above, God didn't overlook the fundamental principle of the Torah. And you're really asking the other question, why didn't God just give the fundamental principle of the Torah, and that might have been enough? So that's a different question. I'm not prepared to attack that question, Frank, tonight. But I think that also has validity. But I really would like each person, please unmute yourself. I'm really concerned about sound in here, though, because it's a little noisy in here tonight. I'm not sure why. So I hope you can hear my voice and it's not jumbled with a lot of other voices. But
Coming through super clearly.
Good, thank you. So could you, if someone would please venture, let's answer this question. Could someone propose an answer or tell me what you see in the 10 Commandments, which is indicative of the principle of love your neighbor as yourself? That's what I would really like to see happen now.
I could take a stab at that.
Okay, and can people hear Frank when he talks? That's what I'm concerned about. Go ahead, take a stab at it.
I see love your
Maybe
neighbor.
you should sit here.
Okay.
Maybe that'll work better. I have no idea. Yeah, I guess the microphone is probably in the front.
I could see love your neighbor as yourself as being indicative of the man-to-man commandments, numbers 6 through 10. Maybe also number 5, but not necessarily of the man to God commandments.
But show me love your neighbor as yourself someplace in the 10 Commandments.
I look at it the other way. I see love your neighbor as yourself as being a set, and these other commandments being a subset, at least the man-to-man commandments being a subset.
Meaning, do not murder is affirming of the idea of loving your neighbor as yourself. Do not commit adultery is it affirming of that. Do not steal.
Right.
Okay, and it's interesting. I mean, when you say do not steal, and we know, by the way, you may not know this, but do not steal in the 10 Commandments means do not kidnap. It doesn't cover simple stealing.
Right.
But I guess certainly if you loved your neighbor as yourself, you wouldn't kidnap them.
That's right.
Right. Okay. I guess what you're saying is that all the 5 between human and human, if I covet my neighbor, if I bear false testimony, if I steal, kidnap him, if I commit adultery, if I murder the person, I'm basically not loving my neighbor as myself.
That's the way I see
Right.
it.
Okay. And does that, but does do not murder mean love your neighbor as yourself? No. I mean, if anything, I say, that's, you're doing it the other way, which is fine. Anybody have any other ideas? And I guess I do want to give not a hint, but a concept here, which we could utilize also. When we discussed the 10 Commandments previously, we looked at grouping 1 and 6, 2 and 7, 3 and 8, 4 and 9. Sorry, I thought I had this lined up better. And 5 and 10 as principally associated with each other. And I'll give you an example, and this comes from the discussion we had previously. Rabbi Foreman has a discussion like this in Aleph Beta. To the extent that I feel I am Hashem, your God, that I accept God, and the prohibition of murdering a fellow human being. So the bridge there is that human beings are created in the image of God. And therefore, if I murder someone, I'm not only attacking a fellow human being, but I'm also not recognizing the other person as a being who is created in the image of God. And to the extent that I'm not doing that, or to the extent that I'm destroying an image of God, I'm also denying the fact that God is my God. Right? Those are the links that go across. But let's see if maybe this helps us, maybe it doesn't help us. But does anybody have any other ideas? I really, it's summertime. We'll have to let our hair down a little bit. There's no really bad answers here. I just wanted to look at the 10 Commandments and see how they might shed light on what it means to love your neighbor as yourself, and how Rabbi Akiva could say this is the fundamental principle of the Torah when God did not pronounce it at Mount Sinai and he pronounced these other 10. Any other ideas? All you have to do is please unmute yourself, be brave. No harm, no foul here. Well, let's do the following. Let's look at, and Frank already, we discussed the 1 and 6. Let's look at 2 and 7 together. Do not have any other gods between you and God, and do not commit adultery. So clearly the connection between 2 and 7, if we want to make a connection and build a bridge between the two, is that to the extent that I have a relationship with God, so placing another God between me and God, and that's really the wording of the Torah here, right? That's what is the wording here? Actually, this wording is not so good because this is according to Rashi, but it says, you shall not have other gods, al ponai, in my face. So the idea is, to the extent that I'm meant to have an active relationship with God, and mirroring the idea that marriage is a commitment between two people which has a sanctity to it, and adultery is for a person to violate that relationship. So both 2 and 7 can be understood properly as talking about having inviolate or protected relationships in your life. You hear that idea? And to the extent that I have a protected relationship with God, and I honor the fact that my fellow has a protected relationship between him and his wife, and I'm not going to transgress that relationship. So in that sense, this sounds already like loving your neighbor as yourself. Does that resonate with anybody? Because in other words, what does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. So first of all, you treat him. The word neighbor, we'll stay with the word neighbor. It's not a bad translation. Friend, neighbor, someone who you share space with. So in other words, for a person to fulfill v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, a person first and foremost has to understand that there is a connection between me and my fellow man. Okay? So we would all agree that whereas I might throw out an old sofa when I get tired of it without committing a terrible crime or sin, but if I just throw aside my friend or any interest in relationship to my friend because I'm tired of it, that's not fulfilling the idea of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, a person who I've established a connection with. Okay, do we hear that? So 2 and 7 are built on the sense of there being a relationship, and that relationship having significance, and that relationship significance imposing upon me constraints in the way I'm going to act. Okay? So I happen to like that idea. And I happen to think that the idea of that if it's a fundamental principle of the Torah, I would circle 2 and 7 as being insightful. And the light, it would help me shine on the mitzvah of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha as being a fundamental principle of the Torah would be that Rabbi Akiva is understanding this as meaning people are related to one another. Human beings are connected to one another. Not to the extent that I'm connected to God, and not to the extent that my neighbor and his wife are connected to one another, and therefore I honor that relationship by not intruding upon it. But at least within reasonable terms, loving your neighbor as yourself means that there's an implicit relationship between you and me also, which needs to be respected, and which therefore needs to constrain the way we act toward, or define the way we act toward each other, that we're in relationship with one another. And within that relationship, I'm going to have obligations to help you, to be kind to you. You're going to have reciprocal relationships to me. And certainly such things as taking revenge and bearing a grudge and speaking ill of you, which are the things the Torah talks about in Leviticus, right around the idea of loving your neighbor as yourself. Those things would clearly be similar along the same lines as having other gods stand in between or create a breach in your relationship with God Almighty. And they would certainly be somewhat analogous to the idea of a person intruding on the marital relationship of his friend. So let's see if we can keep this going. Let's look at 3 and 8. So not swearing falsely obviously is dishonesty. Do not steal involves dishonesty. Frankly, that pair doesn't resonate with me so well, does it with anybody else? Anybody have anything to say about that, please?
Do not swear falsely. Usually I see that commandment, the third commandment, written as do not carry God's name in vain.
Okay.
Which seems to me different from saying do not swear falsely. Do not swear falsely sounds almost like number 9, do not bear false testimony.
1 second. Am I making a mistake here in my reading? Yeah, I'm a little bummed out that these things don't line up. I spent time on 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Right. Okay. 1 second.
What happened?
No, we're okay. We're okay.
Swearing falsely is a kind of kidnapping because you're damaging somebody's reputation, perhaps.
Okay, or you're okay. Thank you. That's a breakthrough idea. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I got lost there a little bit because we have to relate it to kidnapping. And swearing falsely is like appropriating God's name for your own purposes, which would be similar to appropriating someone else for your own purposes, which is what kidnapping is. In other words, if I say, if I were to say the words, I swear to God that I did not do this, and it's not true, right? That fits in with what we're talking about, using God's name inappropriately. So it's like I'm stealing God's identity for my own purposes. And if I steal another human being, I kidnap them for my own purposes. I'm also misappropriating something that's not mine. Again, you know, these negative things are a little harder to deal with because just like Frank said in the beginning, certainly murdering someone is a violation of loving your neighbor as yourself. But it's such a gross violation that it seems to me removed from it. It doesn't seem that not murdering someone is an illustration of the idea that I love somebody. So not stealing your identity by not misappropriating your identity. Okay, that's an element of it's an element of respecting another. I'll buy that. But I just wanted to try because then I want to reflect on what the mitzvah of love your neighbor as yourself is all about. Let's look at 4 and 9. 4 is keeping the Shabbat, and 9 is not bearing false testimony. And you know, for there, we just need to know the concept is that observing the Shabbat is we say is like testifying that God created the world. That's the concept of keeping Shabbat. That's why when Friday night when we make Kiddush and we say Vayechu Hashemayim ve'aretz, we're bearing testimony to the fact that this is the truth, and obviously false testimony is the inverse of that. Anyone have any ideas of how to connect that to the concept of loving your neighbor as yourself. I'm not hearing too much of an overwhelming response, but I don't have a lot to say about that either. But let's look at 5 and 10. I do have something to say about 5 and 10, and hopefully you will as well. Number 5, let's first of all see, can we build a bridge between the imperative of kabedet avicha v'et imecha, a person's obligated to show honor and deference to their father and mother, and the idea of not coveting what someone else has? Anybody able to build a bridge between those two? Make a connection between how those two commandments might be related to each other first?
Maybe because if a person is a jealous person, or they're jealous of their children won't respect them.
If they're okay, if they're, you mean you'll lose your that's interesting. If you, so you're reading it like that if a parent is a jealous person, then it'll be harder for their children to honor them.
Right, because they won't see their parents as somebody who's happy with what they have, and therefore they won't be happy with what they have. And that goes for materialism plus the people that have raised them.
Right. So I guess I just want to build on that thought a little bit and just share my idea here in the interest of time. And that's this, that if a person is desirous of what someone else has, to an extent, what they're saying is, I'm not happy being who I am. I would rather be that person. I would rather live in that house. I would rather have that wife. I would rather have that person's possessions. So in a certain sense, it's a betrayal of an understanding that I have what I have and you have what you have, and I can live comfortably with both of those things. And here already we could see it could spill over to honoring your father and your mother, because let's say I'm a person who really doesn't like my nose. And my nose happens to look very much like my father's nose. You know what I'm saying? I'm just using something a little ridiculous, but there's the sense of honoring parents is a person understanding that these are the two people who, together with God, brought me into the world and gave me life and sustained me in my early years of life. And for me to reject a sense of obligation towards them to act in a certain way is a way to, in a sense, rejecting who I am as a person. If a kid really is embarrassed, at who their father and mother is, the parents have every right to look at the child and say, well, are you embarrassed about who you are? You ultimately are the product of the two of us, and accept yourself for who you are, accept us for who we are, and then by extension, accept your lot in life and what you have and what you possess as being appropriate for you, and stop being coveting of what someone else has. You hear our idea? Now here already, I think I want to just build a definite bridge to the phrase in the Torah of the Ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You should love your neighbor like you love yourself. That's what the Torah says. So the Torah, it's interesting, the Torah doesn't just say love your neighbor, but love your neighbor as yourself. If I despise myself, or if I'm embarrassed at who I am, or if I reject my parents for who they are, especially as I feel it reflects on me, or if I living my life covetous and jealous and wanting to be another person other than myself, in all these regards, I don't have a fundamental grip to then love someone else when I'm not loving myself yet, when I'm not comfortable with who I am. You hear our idea?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, I'd just like to toss in Rabbi Sax's take on Rabbi Akiva's words of loving your neighbor as yourself.
Okay.
You know, he said, Rabbi Sachs said, it seems almost an impossible requirement. How can you love any other person, even a very close person, let alone a neighbor, as much as you love yourself? So Rabbi Sachs interpreted those words as meaning, just as a person does not see his own faults and see his own shortcomings, he should be that way towards others as well.
Okay, and that really is a concept based on the Ramban Nachmanides, because Nachmanides has a tension in the Torah which says that, you know, going back to the famous case, if I have one flask of water and I'm in the desert, I need to keep the water for myself rather than giving it to you, because we have a principle that my own life comes before yours. And doesn't, but if I love my neighbor as much as I love myself, why do I get to drink the water? And the answer to that is what you're saying. There's Nachmanides therefore says that it's a question of mimicking or applying the way I think about myself towards thinking about other people. Okay. So I want to, now anybody have anything else to say here? But I think what we're getting from this 5 and 10, from looking at the bridge between 5 and 10, which is recognizing yourself and recognizing your uniqueness, is that the same way a person tends to have a natural regard for oneself, and like Frank says, cover oneself over, dismiss one's flaws, not harp on things which which we may not think is our best dimension. We have the opportunity to act similarly to other people, and that's what the Torah wants us to do. To, in a certain sense, apply our bias toward ourselves to the people around us, and not be overly judgmental, which is the usual manner in which people feel. They're very forgiving about themselves, and they're very judgmental about others. And the Torah is telling us that we're commanded as the Jewish people to reverse that. So I'll tell you a thought I had when I was going through this exercise is there happened to be another source which in that same Sifra, where Rabbi Akiva says this is the fundamental principle of the Torah. Ben Azai comes along, another Talmudic sage, and says, I disagree with Rabbi Akiva that this is the fundamental principle of the Torah. And I feel the fundamental principle of the Torah is that man is created in the image of God. And he says, and I'll explain to you why. He says, because there are people in the world who don't have a lot of self-respect, and who if you embarrass them, it seems not to bother them. So therefore, they wouldn't be ready to not embarrass another based on the way they see themselves. So he says, Ben Azai feels that more fundamentally than looking at your own bias toward yourself and treating other people that way, which is an understanding of what Rabbi Akiva says, if we would instead see ourselves and others as rooted in being created in the image of God, then that will go further. That will cover all human beings, even those people who are lacking in self-respect or self-regard, and therefore it's even more fundamental to the Torah than is what Rabbi Akiva said. So with this in light, in other words, it's just very interesting to me, because if I wanted to defend Ben Azai here, his statement, I would say that the linkage between number 1 and number 6 of I am the Lord your God and do not murder, which we said is that to the extent that I recognize that all people are created in the image of God. So it almost looks to me like Ben Azai would answer our question here and say, Rabbi Weiser, I like your question about where's Rabbi Akiva's principle in the 10 Commandments, because I see my principle as more fundamental, and I see my principle as deriving directly from 1 and 6.
Me too.
Right. Okay. So, but I wanted to just to think a bit more about this idea, this imperative of loving your neighbor as yourself, or loving other people in general. Because the truth is, if you sit down with many people, and certainly if you sit down with kids, they can accept the idea, I can't punch the other kid, I can't embarrass the other kid, I can't steal from the other kid. But they can't wrap their heads readily around the idea that I should love the other kid, that I should be willing to do for the other person, that I should see myself as living in relationship to the other person, and therefore wanting to deepen that relationship, strengthen that relationship, and honor that relationship, perhaps in everything I do. You know, and if you think about it in the Torah, you've got a lot of mitzvot there. For one, for example, returning a lost object. You know, it's just an interesting idea. You know, we used to say, you know, finder, keepers, losers, weepers. You know what I mean? It's not so clear to people morally that because you and I are fellow human beings and we're both created in the image of God, that if you're walking down the street and you drop something, I should pick it up and do everything in my power to give it back to you and to make sure you're made whole. And we can hear how that's the idea of loving your neighbor as yourself. After all, if I lose something, I really appreciate it if somebody gives it back to me. So it's, you see, what Rabbi Akiva is saying is that it's not that the negatives of not murdering perhaps fit more into an idea of not violating relationships, but having relationships shape and determine who you are, and to feel you're wrapped up in that relationship. That's what Rabbi Akiva seems to be saying. And it's still a little elusive to me where you see that in the Ten Commandments.
Where you see what?
The idea that I'm to live with a sense of relationship to all other human beings, which places upon me positive and negative obligations, not to embarrass you, not to take revenge, not to humiliate you, not to steal from you, and at the same time to return your lost object, to teach you Torah if I have advantages in learning Torah over you, or if I have Torah ideas to share with you, to do kindness with you, to act toward you, perhaps even in a manner that imitates the way God acts towards all of us, which is wanting our good and our welfare and wanting to bestow good upon us, which ultimately is the lines we're talking about of the fulfillment of the Ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Even if you accept Rabbi Sachs's limitation that I'm not able to love another to the same extent, you know, so that when there's one piece of herring left in the Kiddush, I'm bound to eat that myself. But at least if there are two pieces of herring in the Kiddush, I'm happy to say, hey, how about if you take one and I'll take one? Because after all, we're friends, we're in relationship, we live in the same community together, and that's my way of honoring the fact that we have a connection to one another. You see, so we really have to look for that to come.
So when you put Rabbi Akiva's and Rabbi Azai's principles side by side, what point are you making with respect to each principle?
Well, Ben Azai makes the point that his is more inclusive of all people. That's his point. So he feels that makes it more fundamental. Rabbi Akiva's point has to be the idea that living in relationship to others is a fundamental idea of the Torah. And in a certain sense, every one of the 10 commandments is that. Because any mitzvah between me and God means that I'm in this world in relationship to God. So that if God rested on the Shabbos, I'm going to rest on the Shabbos. If I'm going to misappropriate God's name, I'm violating that relationship. And then by extension, at least on the negative side, I'm not going to harm another person because I'm in relationship with you. But it still doesn't include the positive. So I want to suggest something else here. And I think it's an important idea, and it answers something that I've been looking for a little while. And I'm really going to cheat here in terms of the structure. But the Vilna Gaon says that he connects the mitzvot of the Ten Commandments differently. Instead of connecting 1 and 6 and 2 and 7 and 3 and 8 and 4 and 9 and 5 and 10, the Vilna Gaon tends to connect 1 with 10, 2 with 9, 3 with 8, 4 with 7, and 5 with 6. I'm not going to go through all of them, and I don't have a clear understanding of all of them. But let's look at number 10 itself, which in many ways is the most troubling or fascinating of all the mitzvot. Because it's the only commandment of the 10 commandments that you're not allowed to be jealous and covet what your friend has. That provokes the question that Ibn Ezra asks, is it humanly possible for a person not to violate this commandment? And also points out the idea that unlike all the other commandments, it seems to be an attitude that the Torah is mandating rather than an action. Now, you should just know, according to Jewish law, I only violate number 10 of coveting if I take an action to take something away from you. Okay, that happens to be a fact. So if I come knocking on your door and I say, I really want to buy your car because I want it, and your car is unique, you couldn't just go out and buy another one of it, more like your wife or your other possessions you have. And you were to say, no, I love my car, I want to keep it. And I even were to say to you, I'll give you all the money I have for your car because I must have your car. And I implore you to sell it to me, and you sell it to me, that's a violation of the 10th of the 10 commandments. Okay, or if I cajole you, or if I pressure you and you actually sell it to me, or I gain possession of it. So it also requires an action. But we still have to go back to the Ibn Ezra's question. How is it humanly possible for two people to not be jealous of one another? And I want to just share with you a little thinking about this, and you may agree, you may not agree. First of all, the easiest thing for a person, the easiest thing to stop a person from being jealous of another person is to say have nothing to do with the other person. And if I keep to myself and I feel as though I'm living in a very alien world where everybody is crazy, no good, whatever, then, and I don't feel camaraderie with other people, then that's a way of dampening a sense of jealousy. It also might make me into a serial killer, and it might make me into a marauder or a bandit and other things like that. So I'm not recommending it as a great way of living your life. But you see, really, the notion of desiring of being homemade, that which someone else has, comes most from being associated to other people. I invite you to my house on Shabbos, and we're having a nice time, and you notice the fact that my silverware is from Tiffany and it costs $600 a piece. And you say to yourself, wow, it's really a cool thing to be able to use silverware like this every week. I wish I had that silverware myself. Okay, so you see, it's really out of association with one another that breeds a sense of, well, why do you have it and I don't? After all, and I mean, I could fall back on Ben Azai and say, after all, we're both created in the image of God. You don't deserve it more than I do. So maybe you can say, well, if I'm a good Republican, I'll say, well, I worked harder. If you worked as hard as me, you would have it also. but we're talking here about a fundamental idea of us being able to live in association with one another and yet not fall victim to a sense of jealousy.
Well, but you can say the same thing about all the commandments 6 through 10. If you're not associating with other people, there's no chance of committing any of those violations, 6 through 10, not just number 10.
The only thing is that and I don't want to carry this too far, because a lot of antisocial behavior is from people who are disassociated from everybody else. So that's a high risk statement. But in a certain sense, in other words, now, if I am paranoid that somebody's going to be jealous of me, I don't invite anybody to my house. I keep everything in my safe deposit box. I hoard it. I'm happy with it. I might take it out at 2 o'clock in the morning and kiss my silverware and say, look how lucky I am and how I have such wonderful possessions and thank God for giving them to me. And then I quickly put them away because I don't want anybody else to take them from me or to even be jealous of me. Okay. But that also is a violation of the whole concept of love your neighbor as yourself. You see? So what I'm trying to say is this, that perhaps what Rebbe Akiva understood is that the following: if we have commandment number 10, otachmod, not to be jealous, covetous of what the other person has, how could a person possibly maintain that standard of accepting the fact 100% that what yours is yours and what's mine is mine? And even though I clearly recognize that yours is better, more pleasing, more alluring, more attractive, I'm still not going to desire it. So this is where the Vilna Gaon comes along and says it's a pure reflection at the quality of your relationship with God. To the extent that I'm at peace with God and I feel secure in a relationship with a loving, caring God, I understand that God decided that you have the Tiffany silverware and I don't. And after all, I understand that the moral challenges of life are very encompassing, and every person has their own mission and goal. Everyone has their own individual relationship with God also, and that God, as a partner with each and every one of us, placed our soul in the hands of this mother and this father, and in connection with them brought a human being into the world. You see, so what I'm trying to do is weave a sense that it's in relationship to God and to one another that the whole 10 commandments are underpinned and make sense and are workable and become a system of thinking. And of course, the most fundamental relationship of all is I am Hashem, your God, which to the extent that a person really feels that and is aware of it and cultivates an active connection with God. So to the same extent that I do that, am I able to quell any sense of covetousness and jealousy, and accepting myself for whom I am, and accepting my parents for whom they are, and feeling thankful for all the gifts that God has given me individually, different from everybody else's mix of gifts. And then I'm ready to undertake all 10 commandments in a certain sense of doing it in connection with God and in connection with human beings, which is clearly what the first 5 and the second 5 commend us to do. This idea of melting together bein Adam l'chavero, obligations and relationship to your fellow man, which clearly loving your neighbor as yourself speak about, drawing upon the vibrance and the depth and the security and connection I have in I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. Don't have any false gods. Don't misappropriate my name. Give testimony to the fact that I created the universe in 6 days and rested on the 7th day, and that I, God, chose your father and mother to be my partner in bringing your soul into this world so that you could have the unique life and opportunity that you have. And then don't squander that by murdering, which would be a denial that another person's also created in the image of God. So in other words, recognize him as part of her part of the picture. Do not commit adultery. Give deference to the other relationships in the world. Not to steal, kidnap another human being. Recognize the fact that you share the world with other human beings, and not bearing false testimony in the sense of, in a way, and I don't have this so clearly, but as mischaracterizing or recreating reality in a way that suits me best, because testimony creates reality. in the world. And that's what it's doing. And that all feeds into the idea of really being genuinely happy and satisfied with who I am. And I wanted to just bear this out with a quotation from a book called Orchos Sadiqim, The Ways of the Righteous. And he makes a very interesting statement. It's on page 71 in the volume I have, but I could tell it's under the gate of joy and happiness. He makes what seems to be an audacious statement. He says it's impossible for any human being to continue to act in accordance with the Torah unless that person has a recognition that God runs the world and that he can develop a sense of contentment with what he has in comparison to what other people have. Of course, you can take that two ways. I can look at what I have compared to others and become arrogant and haughty and feel as though I'm better than everybody else, which is also antithetical to the idea of loving your neighbor as yourself. Or I can feel inferior to other people, and therefore I'm riddled by jealousy and hatred and pettiness, and feeling as though everybody has somehow infringed on what's rightfully mine. What I want to say, just to pull this together, is the following: that when we look at 613 mitzvot in the Torah, and then we're looking at amalgamating those mitzvot so that they touch upon one another. So the 10 commandments have meaning 1 to 6 and 2 to 7, or 1 to 10 and 2 to 9, in all these different ways. And along comes Rabbi Akiva and says, which might be most of all saying that it's through relationships that a person can come to live up to the principles and values of the Torah. And then anchoring all relationships has to be your relationship with God. Because unless a person develops that relationship with God and comes to peace with the fact that God runs the world in a way that is ultimately fair, ultimately kind, even though it's not the way I would run the world, but I respect it's the fact that it's the way that God wants to run the world, then a person can have robust, meaningful connections within a marriage, so that adultery becomes a real act of violation of a cherished relationship, valuing all human life so that murder becomes something abhorrent, living honestly, living with a pride and connection to family, and living comfortably in the world with what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours, in the sense that, of course, I'm happy to use some of mine to help you, because that's upholding of the principle of kindness. And after all, that God gave me everything I have anyway. But I'm doing it in living in relationship with others, and that's the essence of what makes the Torah happen and what gives meaning and purpose to life, and which is the way for us to understand the 613 mitzvot, which make up the Torah itself. And hence this becomes the fundamental principle of the Torah. That's the thinking I wanted to put out there. Happy to answer any questions if I can.
It sounds like you're maybe suggesting that the fundamental principle of the Torah, rather than what Rabbi Akiva is putting forth, and rather than what Ben Azai put forth, might be commandment number 1. Is that what you're saying?
But because commandment number 1 by in and of itself, see, that can't be the fundamental principle, because that would breed isolation and seclusion. And I want to go to a desert island and sit and daven and learn Torah and feel connection to God. And if I do that, then I'm missing out on huge sections of the Torah that would become irrelevant to me.
So what was
And by the same token, if I'm only interested in being a great guy and being beloved by everybody around me, that was also a misconstrual, and it wouldn't put into focus all 613 commandments of the Torah either. But what Rebbe Akiva, to my mind, is stressing is when you look at the 10 commandments, which certainly are the categories under which all 613 mitzvot fall, understand them as being born of relationship, and as your relationship between you and God in concert with relationship between you and your fellow man, in a way that can balance and harmonize all of those together. And that's the essence of what Rebbe Akiva is saying. That's the thought. All right, it's summertime. Everybody should have a good week. Please stay tuned for next Tuesday night. There may not be a class next Tuesday night. I will try to let everybody know a day in advance. But so I'm sorry about that, but let's stay tuned for that.